Okay, sorry I'm arrived a bit late. My name is Ulf Sverdrup. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here to this seminar today. Two reasons for this, well, actually three. The first is that we have this opportunity to introduce to you our new scholar, Marc Lanteigne, who joined us just 3 weeks ago. He came from all the way from New Zealand. He's Canadian. He's been working a lot on China's policy in the Arctic, but also Chinese foreign policy in general. So he joins our group on emerging powers, and he's going to give a nice presentation today, I think, and hope on China's strategies in the Arctic. I'm also glad to welcome Leif Lunde, our colleague and director of our, not a sister institute, but a competitor, but also collaborator, working on Chinese policies in the Arctic and in the High North in general. So a very competent contributor to our discussion today. And of course, also, as always, glad to see that we have so many competent people in the audience as well. So I look forward to a good discussion. Now, today the topic is China's strategies in the Arctic, emerging economic diplomacy. As you know, politicians from all over the world these days meet in the UN, and one of the things to discuss is global heating and the climatic changes. And Arctic is a key element to that. In addition to this, we experienced recently, or during the last few years, increased interest into the Arctic. It's been one of the priorities of Norwegian foreign policy, but it's also increasingly the priority of other countries. And today we're going to learn more about China's strategies in the Arctic. And as you all are aware of, China has recently paid a lot of attention to the Arctic, together with other Asian countries, and they achieved the status of being a formal observer in the Arctic Council in May 2013. And there's general interest, both from politicians, but also businesses and various think tanks, and also, of course, scientists. So there are two issues that we'd like to discuss today. And the first is the greater Chinese and East Asian interest in the Arctic. Would it lead to greater internationalization of the region? And how will the Arctic states respond to that? And the other topic relates to the economic opening of the Arctic. Would it lead to improved avenues for cooperation or competition among Arctic states and others? So now I'm proud to give the floor to Marc, or new signing, so to say, in speaking in the football jargon. So please, Marc, please. And then you go on and give a talk. Leif will give a short comment, and then we open the floor for discussion. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for being here. I think this is working. Okay, great. First of all, thank you very much for coming. This is my first official presentation here at NUPI in Oslo. I've had a chance to visit Norway quite a few times in the past, and I just want to say it's great to be back. So what I wanted to do with this presentation is talk a little bit about how China's foreign policy is beginning to integrate itself into the Arctic region. And there's been a lot of debate about this. There's been a lot of media coverage about China in the Arctic, what its interests and goals are. And what I want to do with this session is basically to start taking apart some of the kind of preconceived ideas about China's Arctic policy, and also talk a little bit about how it fits in with China's expanded foreign policy, especially over the past 10 years. First of all, I started my work in this part of the world looking at the idea of cross-regional diplomacy. It's important to remember that when you look at China's international relations, a lot of it is still very new, and a lot of it is still very much in the evolutionary process. Up until, I would say, maybe a dozen years ago, maybe a bit longer, China's foreign policy priorities were considerably smaller in scope. There was a great deal of emphasis on East Asia, obviously, a great deal of emphasis on the United States, Russia, obviously. But moving beyond that, moving towards other regions, including, for example, Europe, Africa, Latin America, and the Arctic. Intense study of these regions, intense interest, policy-wise, that China has had in these regions is still very new. And you definitely see that process going on in the Arctic right now. One of the questions I looked at when I was doing research in the region last year, and I had a chance to talk to specialists both in the Arctic region and in China, and one question which I posed is, well, are we going to be seeing a white paper, a governmental paper from China on Arctic policy? And many specialists in China said, well, probably not yet, or probably not right away, for the reason that China's Arctic policy is still very much being undertaken. A politician had said a few years ago that China has no Arctic policy. I think a few years back, I think that situation is changing quite a bit. And I would not be surprised if we were to see a more concrete China policy appear from Beijing in the near future. But for now, China's Arctic policy is still very much a work in progress. So when we talk about what are China's interests, there are usually four areas that get brought up first. First and foremost is the area of scientific research. This is an area where China's interests in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, I should point out, have grown quite a bit in a very short time. China has been very interested in developing scientific partnerships with the Nordic states to examine issues, including, but not limited to, climatology, climate change, glaciology, geology. China has been very active in looking at how, not only how these processes work, but how they may affect China. And Beijing has been very active in looking for partners and looking for ways of increasing that level of scientific research. And as many of you know, there is a research station, along with several other countries, in Svalbard, in Nyasund. I think I pronounced that all right. Still getting the accents down. And China is very interested in continuing its diplomacy through scientific means. Three other areas, though, are going to be more of a focus for this presentation. The second point, and this has obviously gotten a great deal of media scrutiny lately, is the idea of access to resources. And what I mean by resources is not only fossil fuels, the oil and gas that may be possible to exploit in the region, because of climate change, because of a receding of ice conditions in much of the Arctic, but also metals and minerals, which have gotten a lot less coverage, but are also a very important aspect of China's potential economic interests in the far north region. Third, another area that's gotten quite a bit of press, the Northeast Passage, otherwise known as the Northern Sea Route. With the retreat of the ice north of Siberia, this route is now being looked at very seriously, not only by China, but by many other Asian states that rely heavily on trade with Europe, with North America, as a faster and less expensive way of bringing goods to Western markets. And then finally, you have the events that have taken place since last year, the Kiruna Arctic Council meeting, where the number of formal observers in the Arctic Council grew by quite a bit. China, along with various other Asian governments, including Japan, India, Korea, achieved observer status. And again, the media, especially the international media, media outside of Asia, made quite a bit of play with this. They made reference to, well, China is now a permanent observer in the Arctic Council, and now that it has a great deal of decision-making capability. And again, this needs to be unpacked. China does not have an Arctic border. China does not have the ability to vote in the Arctic Council, nor is that in the offing, nor does any other observer at this point. So one question which I look at is, now that China, along with other Asian governments, are in the Council as observers, how will that affect the questions of growing legal areas, growing governance issues? Will there be a role for the observers, including China, but certainly not restricted to China? So these are the four areas I've been looking at. In terms of resources, we are now seeing a great deal of discussion and debate about how the Arctic could conceivably be opened up to fossil fuel exploitation. There was a survey that was released in 2008, and many people look at that as kind of the catalyst for the big debate over oil and gas and other resources in the Arctic. A US geological survey suggesting that 13% of the world's untapped petroleum, 30% of the world's untapped natural gas could conceivably be found in the Arctic. This is still debated, but these are the numbers which are very often bandied around. There are also the possibility of metals and minerals, which are now becoming much more accessible, which are very important to various economies, including China. I'm going to be speaking further on the subject of Greenland, which is the focus of the metal and mineral debate. When this report came out and when people started to look at the Arctic as an area of economic importance, well, a lot of reports magically appeared very suddenly, suggesting that there was going to be a resource scramble or a great game. And I hesitate to use the term great game. I had a professor in Halifax that used to dock his students 5% for using the term great game, so please don't tell him I just did that. But this is the idea, that there would be a massive resource scramble, there would be a big push and pull over maritime borders, and we'd all be in trouble long before now. This has obviously not taken place. One example, the previously disputed maritime border between Norway and Russia. There were many reports saying that this was going to be a huge security issue and an intractable diplomatic problem. And as some of my colleagues here at NUPI have written on this and studied this, hasn't been the case. There are still some maritime disputes, but they have been greatly restricted to the diplomatic arena. So the report, just to jump back to the report for a moment, suggests that there are areas that oil and gas can most readily be found. You can see the dark green areas here, north of Alaska, north of Siberia, which suggests that these areas could, over time, be subject to a great deal of oil and gas exploration. So this would be the oil in dark green. The gas situation, as you can see, is very similar. You see the same kind of areas being sought after as major areas of gas exploitation. So again, north of Alaska, seriously north of Siberia, a little bit between Canada and Greenland, and potentially other areas. So the debate began. How would these resources be developed? Who would be taking the lead in terms of setting up these projects? And would there be cooperation or competition? So this has been obviously a subject of a great deal of dispute. China is very interested in the raw material aspects of the Arctic, and there's already been a few areas where China has been active. When I was doing work in Iceland last year, I was following the process of a potential joint oil and gas development project in the Jan Mayen region. This was negotiations between a very small Icelandic company, Aecon, that wanted to bid on potential oil and gas rights in the Jan Mayen region, but needed an international partner. They're a very small unit. They needed a bigger partner. And the China National Offshore Oil Corporation, CNOOC, was the one chosen. Norway, as a result of an agreement that was signed in, I believe it was 1981, had the option of signing on to this project as a 25% partner because the blocks in question were very close to the Iceland-Norway maritime frontier. There was a bit of hesitation from Norway at the beginning, but Norway did agree to assist with this project. So now Petoro is a potential 25% stakeholder in the Jan Mayen project. This is the region in question is called the Drake region, with CNOOC taking 60% of potential fines. This is only just now getting started. It remains to be seen exactly what is down there in terms of oil and gas, but it is kind of China's first major foray into raw material exploration in that part of the region. Norway agreed to assist with the project at the end of last year, despite the, shall we say, diplomatic complications that have taken place over the past 4.5 years. Talking about these complications, just one quick digression. I keep getting reminded of a rather noteworthy Chinese proverb. When we get to the mountain, there will be a way through. And I just want to express my own opinion. I really hope we find the mountain soon. End of digression. Iceland has also very much gotten in on the whole idea of bringing in Asian partners into potential economic deals. Iceland is really starting to see itself now as a gateway for Asia to the Arctic. And a lot of that has to do with Iceland's bumpy relations with the European Union. Negotiations have been halting, to say the least. And the free trade agreement that Iceland signed with China that was finalized last year, the first with a European country. And China and Iceland have very much played up this free trade agreement as another signal that China does have very strong economic interests in the Arctic and really wants to develop partnerships with as many Nordic partners as possible. There has been a lot of progress on other fronts. In Canada, a very controversial deal between CNUC and the Canadian firm Nexen caused a great deal of debate in the Canadian government. Very, very high-level deal. And there is quite a bit of hope that the Alberta tar sands, which for a very long time were considered hopelessly economically unviable, may start to become a major contributor to Canada's energy economy. There have been other deals that Chinese and Canadian firms have made, but they have fallen under a bit of scrutiny, mainly because they've been very slow to develop. There's a question of how much initial profit might be had, but this process is ongoing. And then, of course, we have Russia, which I'm a little hesitant to talk about in deep, mainly because many people in here are way more qualified to talk about Russia than I am, but I will try this anyway. First of all, last year, the joint oil and gas deal between Rosneft and CNPC, the China National Petroleum Corporation, was announced, very groundbreaking. And then, of course, we have the deal that is still getting talked about now, earlier this year, the CNPC Gazprom deal, the pipeline project worth about, okay, that should be $400 billion. That's not $400. I'm sure probably worth more than that. $400 billion, which will process has already started and expects to be online by 2019. So Russia and China, there has been a great deal of debate over whether their Arctic interests, especially economically, will start to converge any further. Very quickly, this gives you an idea of some of the pipeline projects which have been put into place, as well as some which are now in the offing for the next few years. And this has led to a great deal of debate, especially when you consider difficulties between Russia and Europe, Russia and the West. How much of these new oil and gas projects will be geared towards not only China, but also other parts of East Asia, including Japan and Korea. So a lot is happening on that front. I want to talk about Greenland, though. Greenland, too, has started to appear on the radar when it comes to the whole idea of the opening up of the Arctic. Not necessarily because of oil and gas, although there has been some debate that there may be some oil and gas reserves off of Greenland. But most of the attention there has actually been focused on metals and minerals. And this issue has also been wrapped up in the greater question of Greenland's future political status, specifically the question of future sovereignty and perhaps even future independence. Why Greenland? Well, the Greenland ice cap is eroding. It is melting, and there have been a few very alarming reports over the past 2 years, which would seem to suggest that, if anything, the process has accelerated. We're not talking about a small amount of ice, and still the numbers boggle my mind. We talk about an ice cap that is on average 2 kilometers thick, that if it ever vanishes, sea levels would rise about maybe 6-7 meters. It's a lot of ice. So we can certainly talk about the environmental impact of that, but what is happening as well is that areas of Greenland, which used to be completely inaccessible for mining, are now starting to be looked at seriously as potential mining operations. When you look at Greenland on a map, you certainly do not see a small state. When you look at Greenland's population, though, it is a microstate for all intents and purposes. We are talking about a population of about 57,000. At the moment, its economy is primarily limited to fish and seafood, as well as an annual subsidy from Copenhagen each year. But the current government is very interested in changing that. As of 2009, Greenland achieved self-rule, which means that a majority of governance has been transferred to the Greenlandic government, the parliament. But foreign policy and defense are still the purview of Denmark. With the current government of Alika Hammond, there has been a great deal of discussion about whether the erosion of the ice sheet, whether the possibility of mining operations in Greenland will lead to the possibility of Greenland getting enough currency, getting enough capital to make a push for independence. And when I was working in Nuuk, took some pictures there. I don't know who that guy is. He wrecked my shot. I saw and heard a great deal of different views on whether independence is possible. I talked to some government individuals who said, yes, 5 years, that's it, that's all we need. Others who have said 20, 25 years or never. So this is still a very divisive issue. What will happen in Greenland over the next few months is going to be very interesting to look at, because mining in Greenland has gone from being a hypothetical to very much something which is very likely going to be happening soon. And again, there is the question about how Asian economies, including China, might get involved in that process. So when I visited Nuuk for the first time, I had to, I'm completely a non-geologist, I had to basically be sat down by a representative of the Ministry of Metals and Minerals, and I had to have a very impromptu geology lesson. Right before the conversation started, I was handed a rock about this big, looked very ordinary, and I was told, yeah, this is a ruby. It was an uncut ruby, but still looked very impressive. I asked if I could keep it. They said no, very unfortunate. But after that, I was given a bit of a lesson about what potential mining might exist in Greenland in the future. So this map is very indicative of what is the possible here. If you look at each of these little colored spots here, these represent particular types of metals and minerals which are now accessible. So the white is the ice sheet, still way too expensive to exploit. But you look at some of the possibilities here. You see nickel, platinum, iron, coal, rubies, diamonds. Like I was told when I was holding this uncut ruby that if you go about 100 kilometers inland from Nuuk and you know exactly where to go and you don't bump into a polar bear, these rubies are basically lying on the ground. They've been sort of deposited as the ice recedes. So I asked them for a map and they told me they'd get back to me. But anyway, I'll let you know. So, and also I was told up here, the light green areas here, zinc in very, very high quantities and apparently extremely good quality. So plenty of potential mining possibility here. The two areas, though, that are getting most of the attention, besides the gold and the rubies and so forth, first of all is rare earth elements. These are seen as a very important potential contributor to the Greenland economy. Why? Because a majority of rare earths, production of rare earths, are coming from China, between 90 and 97%, depending on which one you're looking at. So we're talking about molybdenum, gadolinium, thallium. Not exactly metals that we've run into every day, but are necessary for all kinds of technologies, including electronics, including green technology. And this is becoming very important, obviously, to the global economy. This has gotten attention from many parts of the world. China has now expressed a great deal of interest in potentially setting up partnerships for the mining and development of rare earths in Greenland. One potential MOU has already been signed. More might be in the offing. The other issue which is causing a bit of headaches for Denmark especially is uranium. Up until last year, uranium mining was considered a hypothetical, but it was also considered to be basically against the law. Up until last year, there was a zero tolerance, they call it zero tolerance policy towards bringing uranium out of the ground. So you don't go near it, you don't touch it, it is a non-issue. But the Alika Hammond government is interested in potentially mining uranium and potentially selling it, similar structure to, let's say, Canada. This has caused a major legal spat between Greenland and Denmark. The Danish government has said, whoa, wait a minute, problem here. Uranium is a defense issue, and that is our area of oversight. The Greenland government has said, no, this is strictly an economic issue, this is strictly a raw material which we wish to sell, therefore we get the final word. So now there's a huge legal case going on, a decision is expected within the next 2 or 3 months, and this too will be a very complicated subject. Some of the uranium, especially in the south, is mixed in with rare earth elements. So if you bring one up, you have to bring the other one up. And uranium is certainly not your average metal or mineral. What do you do with it? Where do you store it? Where do you sell it? Who do you sell it to? How do you secure it? All of this is going to have to be looked at in a very, very short order here. So this is a very, very serious situation for Greenland itself. Many countries have started to look at Greenland for its mining potential. China is one of them. But I should very quickly point out that Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, many other countries are also starting to look at Greenland's potential mining. There's another debate going on between Greenland and Denmark over exactly how much money Greenland can get once mining operations begin, with some reports saying, no, there won't be enough money, there won't be enough profit for Greenland to go anywhere near independence. But the Greenland government saying, well, that's just naysaying. Again, 5 years, maybe 10, and we'll be able to finally become our own country. It's a very, very interesting debate, and it very much depends on who you speak to. Now, one of these potential deals, and this was splattered all over the Danish press last year, and it was amazing how the story kind of puffed out very quickly, was an attempt by a UK company, London Mining, to set up the rights for a potential iron mine in a small location called Isua. You can see it on the map. It's just north of the capital of Nuuk. An iron mine, which was, again, inaccessible for a very long time. The deed for the area passed to multiple companies before London Mining got the rights. Only recently has the area been seen as mineable. And London Mining is very interested in developing the iron there. It had to be explained to me that this iron is of extremely good quality. We're talking between 70 and 75% pure, which, from what I was told, again, non-geologist, this is very unusual. Like outside of India, that level of quality of iron is almost unheard of. So there have been a great deal of enthusiasm for setting up this mine. A potential deal to start bringing up the iron is worth $2.5 billion, conservative estimate. But the problem is, though, and this is the problem that we're going to be seeing all over Greenland when this so-called mining boom begins, all material, all labor, all equipment would have to be brought in. There is no infrastructure there to support any kind of mining operation unless you bring it in, and that includes labor. So then stories started to appear in the Danish press suggesting that, well, apparently London Mining was in negotiations with a Chinese firm to bring in maybe 2,000, 3,000 laborers from China to start up mining operations. And it got a huge amount of coverage, not only in the Danish media, it made it over to the UK, to the US, and that led to a huge debate about, well, what is China doing? Is China trying to get access to these resources before anyone else? Are we dealing with a scramble? Oh no. So the story really got a lot of press, and in some cases there were even some stories that appeared late last year which suggested that Chinese workers had already arrived in Greenland and were starting mining. And no, that was not the case, to the point where the Chinese Foreign Ministry had to issue a short statement saying there are no set Chinese mining interests in Greenland at present, let alone no labor transfer. So it's interesting how the story kind of ran away from the facts. The mine is set to start. There is still the question of how much labor will be required and where would they be brought in from, but there has not been a decision made. Other Chinese firms have engaged in surveying. A firm from Jiangxi 2 years ago began to help various other local firms look at potential copper mining. So some surveys have taken place on the Chinese side, but we are still quite a ways away from any kind of major mining potential. And at the same time, other countries, including, again, Japan, Korea, Australia, and the UK, are also looking at this mining possibility. Okay. Getting to the sea routes. With the melting of the ice cap in the Arctic, and with the erosion of the ice cap in the center of the Arctic, there are now 3 trade routes which are starting to be given a great deal of scrutiny by many countries, including China and other parts of Asia. The first, of course, is the Northern Sea route going north of Siberia, something which has gotten quite a bit of attention for those who are looking at Russia. The other is the Northwest Passage going through the Canadian North. This has also been the subject of a great deal of sensitivity in the Canadian government. There are differences, for example, between Canada and the United States over whether or not the passage should be considered international waters. That is another area. But the third one, which may be an issue not now, but very soon, would be the potential for a summertime direct crossing of the Arctic. People have said that may be possible by 2020, by 2040, pick a number, but the idea of an ice-free Arctic in the summer is now starting to be looked at more seriously. So how would that work in terms of transit? All of these potential routes would, in theory, improve shipping times, which is of crucial importance to states which rely on exports. And again, East Asia definitely falls under that category. Even though there are other routes which are being looked at by China, by others, there is definitely something to be said for the use of these potential Arctic routes. Politically, quite stable, certainly shorter, in theory, cheaper, although, as I'm going to explain in a moment, that's not necessarily the case. There are, however, a lot of issues to still be worked out. The Northern Sea route is still very difficult to navigate, even during summer. It requires, for example, any ship going through that route requires a great deal of extra insurance. The use of a Russian icebreaker, and I did some looking, they're not exactly cheap to rent. We're talking about, on average, a few $100,000 American per trip. And there is still the question of whether or not the Northern Sea route can become, even in the next 20, 30 years, a really viable alternative to the traditional routes, including Indian Ocean, cross-Pacific, and so forth. That said, as somebody pointed out, I was talking to a few Chinese specialists in Shanghai. One upside to going through the Arctic route is at least there's no pirates, except for this guy. He's not so bad. So where does China fit in with this? Well, certainly China has expressed a great deal of interest in starting to make use of the Northern Sea route. And we're seeing this, for example, in areas of Sino-Russian diplomacy. We're certainly seeing this in terms of how China is now perceiving the Arctic as a much more important economic entity. China has a single icebreaker, the Zhuilong, which has been in operation for quite some time. It has been very active both in the Arctic and in the Antarctic, especially over the past 2 years. And a second icebreaker is in the works for potential launch in, I've been told, either late 2015 or early 2016. So this has really kind of cemented China's willingness to have an actual physical presence in both poles. Big story last year, though, a Chinese cargo vessel using this route was considerably shorter than the Indian Ocean. And China has expressed interest in making use of the passage again in the future. That said, though, again, there are quite a few logistical and economic obstacles to be overcome. Why is China interested, specifically in the Northern Sea route? Well, China has placed a great deal of focus, especially over the past few years, to rebalancing its economy, to putting more emphasis on developing domestic markets, to developing small and medium businesses within China as a way of making that a bigger percentage of the Chinese economy, especially in light of the global economic slowdown. That said, though, the Chinese economy is still going to be very heavily based on exports. So the ability for Chinese goods to get to market, to get to Europe, to get to other parts of the world is still going to be crucial. And it is important to look at China's interest in the Northern Sea route as part of a larger issue. Very recently, President Xi Jinping of China just returned from a very extensive tour of the Indian Ocean region, signing various installation deals with Sri Lanka, the Maldives, certainly very active in India. So Xi Jinping has been talking about a new maritime Silk Road in the Indian Ocean. China is also very interested in developments in Central America. A Hong Kong firm, for example, is active in potentially setting up a canal in Nicaragua. So certainly there is a lot of interest on China's part to looking at ways of improving the ability to send goods abroad. Then, of course, there's the Russia factor. The Northern Sea route basically begins and ends with Russian policies in the region. And just over the past few months, there have been an upping of Russian military interests in northern Siberia, reopening of a base in the New Siberian Islands, potentially 2 new bases in the Chukchi region. That's getting a great deal of debate and controversy, but I do stress that these installations are well within Russian waters. Nevertheless, any kind of use of the Northern Sea route will require participation from Russia, so that has to be kept in mind. So very quickly, I'll just talk about the kind of differences between the routes. You look at the red line. This is the potential pattern of East Asian shipping to Europe. You can see it is considerably shorter and potentially considerably cheaper than using the traditional Indian Ocean route. So many other countries, including East Asia, are really interested in taking advantage of this route. The picture below is of the icebreaker Juelong. Okay, a final area I want to discuss is getting back to the Arctic Council. Now, China had been seeking observer status in the Council for some time. And when the lead up to the Kiruna meeting in 2013 took place, there began to be references in the Chinese media as China being a near Arctic state, and that caused a huge amount of discussion and debate, with some critics saying that this is a term which doesn't mean anything, this is simply a handle that Beijing is using in order to put itself closer to the Council. This is a term which does have a great deal of backing. If you look at, for example, there have been a few very high-level reports which have come out in Chinese scientific journals, which have drawn connections to climate change in the Arctic and changing weather conditions in China. There have been some very severe winter weather patterns, and there's been scientific research about, okay, how are changes in the Arctic starting to have an effect on that? So the argument that Chinese researchers have made that, yes, what happens in the Arctic is having a direct impact on us, and it is something that we do need to have a much stronger presence in, has been kind of formed as part of the China as a near-Arctic state argument. Plus the fact that because China's economic interests have become more cross-regional, and because the Arctic is seen as a very important potential economic player, China does want the opportunity to participate in these kinds of debates. Beyond that, though, things get a bit messy. There has been some talk, some debate about the Arctic as an international space. Even though most countries, China included, have been stressing the importance of UNCLOS, the importance of international law, proper territorial waters, there is still a debate circulating, including in East Asia, over how much of the Arctic should be considered international concern. And this is something which has caused a bit of a rift with countries such as Canada, Russia, who have said, well, the Arctic is basically our littoral waters. We should, take the lead in setting up regimes, setting up laws, and looking at the economics. So this is kind of a slow simmering debate which could get more difficult later on. Why is China involved in this? Well, one Chinese researcher on the subject referred to a so-called melon effect, that if things progress in a particular direction, the Arctic could be cut up like a melon. So among the littoral states, and if you're not an Arctic state, well, I'm sorry, you're just not involved in the process. And that is not something which many non-Arctic states would like to see, including in East Asia. The Ilulissat Declaration, for example, it was signed not too long ago by the 5 immediate Arctic states, caused a bit of concern in China and elsewhere, because that seemed to suggest that, again, there seems to be almost a clubhouse atmosphere, and if you're not in the club, too bad. So this is something which China and other East Asian states are becoming increasingly sensitive to. What happens if there is a major diplomatic or strategic dispute in the Arctic? There's been some simmering, for example, the Lomonosov Ridge has been very divisive between Canada and Russia, especially. What happens if these kinds of issues become more heated? Will there be a move towards more kind of a zero-sum thinking about who owns what in the Arctic? And if that were to take place, it would have a very profound impact on those countries that are not Arctic states. Very quickly, I'll talk about the Council itself. You have the members, but as of last year, the list of observers, formal observers, grew quite a bit. You have South Korea, you have Singapore, not necessarily the first place you think about when you think about the Arctic. You have Italy, same issue. But these are countries which are starting to become very concerned about the question of regime building, the question of regional versus international involvement in the region. and they would like a say in the process. Observers cannot vote. Observers are still very restricted in their ability to affect dialogue within the Council. But one question that I'm looking at is, now that we do have this expanded list, will that have an effect on the whole question of the Council's day-to-day operations? And this is a very new question. The Council has been around since 1996, but it's only been, let's say, maybe 5 years that it's gotten this level of international scrutiny. How is that going to affect the process? It's very important. There are very quickly, some other organizations which are starting to appear. Earlier this year at a Yellowknife meeting, the Arctic Economic Council was formed. So the whole idea of the Arctic as a business and as an economic entity is starting to take on greater meaning. Other Track 2 organizations, such as Arctic Frontiers and the Arctic Circle, are starting to shape themselves as potential Track 2 elements for Arctic debate. So again, there are many different avenues now for non-Arctic states such as China to get involved into the debate. And lower photo here, this is the building where the Arctic Council is located. I should point out, though, that it only occupies 1 floor of that building. Not very big. So these are the questions I would like to leave you with. Under current circumstances, will the Arctic continue to be seen as an international concern? To what degree? How will this shape up? What sort of role will China play, not only within the Arctic Council, but also within the greater question of new regimes, new law building, and new diplomacy? What about governance? And I know this is a politically sensitive topic. There are some countries that tend to look at the whole idea of international governments in the Arctic with a great deal of caution, but it is something which will very likely come up. Will China and other non-Arctic states, I do add, will they cooperate or compete for resources and diplomacy? What will be the milieu? Will we see zero-sum thinking? Will we see the idea that, well, we have to look at resources and diplomacy as if X doesn't get it, Y will, or something like that? What about the role, and this is basically Ban Kuo's ghost in the Arctic Council right now, what about the issues with Russia and Ukraine and Western responses? So far, none of this is very heavily spilled over into Arctic debate, but will that continue to be the case? And finally, at what point will the Arctic become a more economically crucial part of the world? And how will that have an effect, not only on Asian interests, not only on regional interests, but on international politics, security, and the environment? And these are very complicated questions, to say the least. Tusen tack. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, I'll just grab it.
In fact, I thought I didn't have any PowerPoint, but I have some files that I would like to use. Is it possible is there any who can copy from this one over towards the end? It's because I have an answer to your last question.
Oh.
But when will the Arctic become economically important? Let me see.
Do you have a USB plug as well?
No.
Oh, okay.
It's not a big one, but just if it's possible to copy this file.
Du kan få det på det har du bilen.
Ja,
Ska ni göra det?
En fin kalles NUPI med dagsavläsare. Den ligger där. Just if possible. I'm sorry I'm so late.
It's okay.
Okay, I can use this. Okay. Can we play it? Okay, yes. Okay, good. Thanks. Thank you. I'm Leif Lunde. I'm director of the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. Our institute has been working on a research project on Asia and the Arctic for 2 years. It's going through 2015. And so I've been working on this issue for some time, and I also met with Marc on several occasions last year. I'm very glad. Congratulations that you are here, and it's going to be very interesting to work and cooperate with you. And thank you for the invitation, which is a promising part of this cooperation. I have some issues, maybe particularly with your last discussion about the Arctic Council and Arctic governance and China's role, which I will return to. But first, I think in your presentation of the different sort of main interests of China in the Arctic, I follow you very much, and I think you're giving a very interesting and comprehensive and also quite balanced discussion about oil and gas and minerals and also shipping, which are very interesting to China and to other Asian countries. But also there has been a lot of hype. So I think you were very sort of balanced in distinguishing between some of the hype and also the need to take a very much long-term perspective on when these resources can mature and become really significant for Asian countries. I think just for the sake of it, I would also add to sort of the main. You had 4 main points, which are sort of China's interest in the Arctic. Thank you very much. Excellent. And I would add also tourism. And maybe to some extent fisheries. I think that is a more distant prospect and only and less important. But I think also then adding governance, which you discussed towards the end. Maybe to a few comments about energy. I think it's important to understand the Chinese landscape and also the hesitation and the concern in China about being over-interpreted in a way that they portray their interest in Arctic resources. Even I think Linda Jacobson, in one of the most sort of quoted studies about China in the Arctic, has interviewed some people high up in the Chinese system, saying that Chinese officials and even researchers were not allowed to talk about energy interest in the Arctic because they were asked just to not mention it, say it's not interesting for China, because they were so fed up with all this hype, all this nonsense to say about how China would be sort of grasping the whole resource picture in the Arctic. So I think I think China was particularly aware of not being misinterpreted about resources and resource hunting in the Arctic in the process of becoming accepted as observers to the Arctic Council. But I think it's an interesting sort of expression of the care and the concern in China about not being misinterpreted in terms of the resources. Very good, thanks. Thanks again. It seems it works. So so in that sense, I think it's gonna on oil and gas and also on mining. I think it's going to be a long-term issue. Just a second. Let me see. Well, yes, here we are. Yeah. Okay. So good. So I think it's important, both with all the economic resources in the Arctic and China's interest, that we have a long-term perspective, that it's a long way ahead, that Russia and the relationship with Russia means everything for China in order to be able to exploit the resources in the Arctic, and that it's a slow approach, and also I think it's important to look at not only the Chinese oil and gas companies, which are now actively making deals with Rosneft and Gazprom, but also look at the finance players in China. China is already owning shares on many blocks on the Norwegian continental shelf, and they are going to be very important strategic players and can become strategic players also in the light of Russian sanctions or sanctions against Russia in the current geopolitical situation. And also I was in Beijing last week and picked up quite some concerns from the Chinese oil companies now that they are making deals in Arctic Russia, again far with the output far into the future, that the value of these deals are starting going down because the Western countries are moving out because of the sanctions. Because what Chinese companies are hoping for in the Arctic is not only the oil and gas that might flow in the future and even be transported on the Northern Sea route from several fields and on to China and also in pipelines, but they are looking for technology and to learn from the Western technology companies and also Western oil companies and Western technology companies. And when they are left with only Russian companies, if this is just continuing like we see it right now, then it's more, they are afraid that it's the blind leading the blind in the Russian Arctic, because neither Russia nor China has the technological competence and experience to extract energy resources from these extremely challenging waters. So there are some very interesting dynamics that right now in terms of what will be the value for China of the comprehensive new deals that are made. But just before trying to answer your last question about the future, a few words about the Arctic and Arctic governance and the role of the Arctic Council and China's role in that perspective. I think it's extremely important to distinguish between the rather universal acceptance that there are a lot of global dimensions now becoming very important in the Arctic, and that it's illegitimate for Asian and European countries to be concerned about the Arctic and to be part of a global discussion about the Arctic. That I think is quite uncontroversial. And just over the last weeks I've been invited to major Arctic seminars in Rome and in Madrid, and so it's not only it's even all the countries on the list that you had who are increasingly getting interested in the Arctic, and not only the Asians. And in 2013, the UK and Germany developed their Arctic strategies, but they were concerned not to call it strategy because they were afraid it would insult the Arctic Council members. So they call it guidelines or policy frameworks. But they are strategies, very diplomatic. Don't challenge the Arctic nations or the UNCLOS at all. But still, you see there is a development. But I think it's still very also evident from these sort of strategies or whatever policy frameworks of UK and Germany, and also of the approach the Asian countries take, that they are extremely careful not to challenge the Ilulissat Declaration and the sovereignty of both of the 5 coastal states, and also the role of the 8 Arctic Council states. If you go through the official documents of China, also in the preparations they made for becoming accepted as an observer to the Arctic Council, there is no mention whatsoever of the Mellon effect or anything like this. It's extremely smart and extremely tactical, and they are writing exactly what Norway and Russia and the other countries want to hear. So I think it's important to distinguish between what some rather isolated researchers might say about the Mellon effect and about the concern that the West or the Arctic countries are slicing up the Arctic and we get nothing. The official approach, I think, is of course you can. There will always be discussions and concerns, and there is a legitimate concern about the future in terms of what role observers can get. But I think it's very important to distinguish fundamentally between China and Italy's and Spain's legitimate ambition to be part of the global discussion about the Arctic on one hand, and whether they want to be key players in Arctic governance on the other. They don't have that ambition, and the 5 and the 8 Arctic countries are not going to allow them to play that role. It is a discussion in the future. I think I agree with you that the role that observers have now will be insufficient. So I think Norway and Canada and the US and Russia and the Arctic states need to gradually to develop a more meaningful role for observers in cooperation with the observers. And so that has to evolve. And in 5, 10, maybe 15 years, there will be it will be a different world where I think China and the other countries will have legitimate voices in terms of becoming more involved, but not on the same line, not questioning the basic sovereignty of the Arctic states. I see that as totally unrealistic, because then Norway could come and question Chinese sovereignty and in the South China Sea. And of course, China understands that they cannot challenge Norwegian sovereignty in the Norwegian Arctic, and at the same time not being challenged about their own sovereignty in the South China Sea. So there are some basic things there. But there is a far distance between these extremes and today, and we need, and my position, and I think we agree on that, is that we need to take into account that the world is changing. And I'm gonna show you the let's see. Oh. Oops, sorry. There was a... Yes, I'm going to show you just two pictures towards the end, and on different occasions I've been involved in debates about what's going to happen in the future and who will be the major Arctic players towards 2030, because I think that is important as in a discussion about how we should also design Arctic governance and what role should we give to newcomers, both other European countries and also the major Asian countries. And then you have to first decide on, or not decide, at least discuss what are the important indicators and criteria for sort of judging the importance and significance of different players. And in this perspective towards 2030, and I'll show you my ranking afterwards, which is everything but scientific. And this is also very speculative. And my ranking is also based on a quite pessimistic perspective on global warming, that global warming continues, that the ice is melting, and that there is a lot more action in the Arctic in 2030 than there is today. And then I'm playing with this sort of distinction between the different indicators, which again extremely subjective, and it has to be challenged. But I'll just show it to you as a background for the next picture. And this is and it's a bit sort of informal in tone, so I hope I don't offend any of the embassy representatives here. But I think just commenting a bit also in relation to the percentages I gave in the former file, I'll have Russia as the supreme Arctic country, and that is extremely challenging in the current geopolitical situation that we see today, because it's going to reign supreme in any Arctic scenario, and if there is no or limited cooperation between Russia and the other countries, there is the danger that the Arctic runs towards a standstill. It may be a bit sort of ambitious as a Norwegian to put Norway so high up, but you saw that I emphasized economic interest quite significantly, and at least if you could make as a condition that the current crisis is evaporating and that the Arctic continues to develop as an economic region, then Norway has a lot of it's both a coastal state, there's a lot of economic resources, not only in the Norwegian Arctic, but there are a lot of Norwegian companies making enormous deals in Russia, and also and that is, and maybe also in Greenland. And I think in a 10-15 year perspective, offshore oil and gas can also become important in Greenland, maybe more important than mining. But it's I agree with Mark that mining is the most important thing in Greenland now, but in the future it might become oil and gas. And China, again, this is on the condition that the current geopolitical situation is not moving out of control. China are already making major deals in the Arctic and are going to continue to do that. And if they continue also to manage relations with Russia well, they will have a high score on many of the indicators that I showed you. And the same with South Korea. Already there is a deal between Russia and South Korea, with South Korea providing 14 LNG ships to transport LNG from the Yamal field in Russia towards Asia in the summer and through Europe and towards Asia the other way around in the winter. So and then the U.S. and this is of course just a joke, but I think I just write this to indicate that there is an interesting tension in the U.S. We predict an interesting tension in the U.S. Between environmentalists and the actors and the players who are interested in developing the economic resources, and I'm definitely predicting a constructive balance in this regard, but there could be a picture where it could be interesting for many of the players in the U.S. to not to trade off, but to give priority to environmental interests in the Arctic. On one hand, maybe as a condition for building the Keystone pipeline or transporting oil from Canada to the U.S. On the other. So there may be trade-offs and there may be strong interests in strong environmental interests influencing U.S. Arctic policies. Also in the light, given that the economic interest, the U.S. economic interests in the Arctic are not so fundamental, are not so fundamental. But it's just a big question mark, and of course it's a joke, but just a quote. But there is a very interesting discussion going on, and there's a lot of interest also towards how the U.S. will manage the Arctic Council chairmanship from 2015 to 2017. And I think I'll stop there, but I'll just indicate this as one approach that has to be substantiated with extremely subjective, a lot of conditions. Condition 1, global warming continues. Condition 2, there is no major long-lasting geopolitical crisis between Russia and the other countries, and so on and so forth, and that the Arctic is continuing to develop as a dynamic economic region. Then you might see something like this in 2030, as just the order of who will be the most important players. And I don't say that this means that the Arctic Council should work on a totally different level, allowing China, South Korea, and Germany and Japan into. They will, even in 2030, if this continues, and if with a high emphasis on economic interests and economic development in the Arctic, there is certainly, first of all, a strong case for the sovereignty or a respect for the sovereignty of the Arctic nations, and I think that is going to be respected. And there is also a strong case for the 5+3 structure of the Arctic Council, which is going to continue. But this development, and that's really my only point, means that all the Arctic nations should work a lot together with the Asians and Italians and others to ensure that the observer role is being developed and that there are meaningful meeting places not only in the Arctic Council but also in other organizations. And it's also important, by the way, in concluding that the International Maritime Organization is an extremely important organization in the Arctic, and China and the other countries already very active there. And there is a negotiation of the Polar Code. And I was in a meeting just in Shanghai 1 year ago with all the major Chinese shipping companies being in a 2-day seminar on the Polar Code with Norwegian and other experts, telling about what is going to happen, what kind of regime will we have in polar shipping and Arctic shipping. So again, but we have to understand the growing significance of Asian and China, and China in particular in the Arctic, and gradually adapt the governance institutions towards that goal. But now I think I'll spend all too much time. But thanks again for very interesting perspectives, and I'll challenge you mostly on the governance issue. Thanks.
Leiv, may I perhaps invite you to come over here to stay together with me around this table, and Mark, you can take the main podium, and then we open the floor for discussion. And thank you so much to both of you for both presenting a very nice overview of some of the developments, pointing to some of the challenges, and probably had a bit of agreement and some elements of disagreements as well. I suggest that you will probably have opportunity, Mark, to get back to some of the comments by Leiv as we go along. But I think it would be nice now to maybe invite the audience in. If some of you would like to have a question, please. Anna, do you have a mic here? Please introduce yourself.
I'm Bjørnar Sverre Tygeson here at NUPI, and I would like to ask Mark, first of all, I'm curious about, it's always this big discussion whenever China is engaging in a new region. And it also ties very much into the hype that I think Leif Lund is very correct on saying often is created in the situations. And what I wonder about is, to what degree is the Chinese policies towards the Arctic being coordinated on a governmental level, and to what degree is it rather individual commercial companies acting on commercial intensives that to a degree might be shaped by financial backing from the Chinese government? So to what degree are we seeing a government coordinated activity in the Arctic, and are we seeing it to a larger degree in the Arctic than we do, for example, with the Chinese engagement in, say, Africa or Latin America? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Very good question. It is really difficult to answer. Whenever you look at a particular region, including the Arctic, to what degree is policy being motivated by, for example, particular ministries or particular interests outside of the Chinese government? One big issue, which I was meaning to bring up earlier, which is also very important when looking at China's role in the Arctic, is that this is still very much a work in progress in terms of overall policy making. There are certain areas of Arctic expertise which have grown very significantly. There are now particular institutes dedicated to the Arctic. But at the same time, Arctic policy is being guided quite a bit, not only by the usual suspects such as the Foreign Ministry, but there are also various other agencies which are involved in input into various aspects of Arctic policy, everything from potential economic deals to the free trade agreement to scientific endeavors. So one area which is going to be important, I think, in the near future is the potential cooperation, coordination, that not only do China's various aspects of the Chinese government informing their Arctic policy, but also how they coordinate with various other governments. It's still a very, not only an opaque process, but still an area that is still being worked out. And that's why I started with the question of an Arctic white paper. Personally, I think that would be a very good idea for two reasons. First of all, it would start to bring together various elements of China's Arctic policy into a single framework, if you will. But the second point, as you correctly pointed out, yes, there has been a great deal of hype. There has been a great deal of misinterpretation of what China's longer-term goals in the Arctic are. And a white paper, or however you want to call it, would do much to dispel some of these myths that are still flying around.
Adding a bit, I also think we might see a white paper in some years, and there's a lot of work being done on it in different ministries and between different stakeholders in China. But I think basically a couple of things that make this into a long-term sort of future thing. Partly it is the hype issue and the fear of being misinterpreted. So if we're going to publish a white paper now, it would be called something, an extremely tentative policy framework or something, not to offend all those who were afraid of these kinds of challenges. But it's also a complex interministerial process with different players struggling exactly as the way that we have it here and in other countries in the US and in Canada and all around. And it's also very important because there's money attached to different priorities, and there is a lot of interest in the shipping sector in China, and they would like to see a white paper because maybe that would implicate that in the next 5-year plan there would be money set aside for investments and for subsidies for investments in ice strengthened shipping and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of, from our sources, there's a lot of discussions going on, preparation for something like a white paper, but they don't see it, the Chinese don't see it as in their interest to present a fully fledged white paper, and I think it's going to take many years. And until then, it's the basic Arctic policies are issue specific. I know the most important one is just as a side implication in their policies in cooperation with Russia, which has a very strong Arctic dimension.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more hands, so please kind of engage in the discussion. In the meantime, let me throw one or two questions into it, Mark. You talked a lot about China and China's interest in the Arctic, but could you say a few words about kind of if you compare China's interest in the Arctic with other Asian countries who are also interested in the Arctic? What is it that makes it hard? Is it just non-Arctic? But if you compare it with Korea or Singapore or India, or some of the other observers, is there something to be said about that?
Yeah. Certainly there are other Asian governments that have started to greatly increase their Arctic interests. And in some cases, there is a convergence of policies with China. The area of the Northern Sea Route, for example, is certainly not restricted just to Chinese interests. Japan, Korea, Singapore. Again, Singapore, not the first place you think of when you think about the Arctic, but when you think about Singapore's very extensive shipping operations and the possibility of, again, making use of a alternative route, one which is shorter, certainly there is going to be some interest in getting involved in that process. The situation with China, though, is, and we see this in Africa, we see this in Latin America, we see this in so many other parts of the world where China has made very recent inroads into. It is under a microscope. It is very much under a microscope in terms of how it is perceived in many parts of the world. Arctic is certainly not the exception here. The main reason, China is an economy which is growing at a very impressive rate. Even though it has slowed down a bit, it is still the #2 economy in the world. There are still some questions as to whether or not China's economic policy will be compatible or incompatible with that of the West. And because of this, I've had researchers in China tell me, well, look at Greenland. Japan is very active there, very interested there. Korea, India, Australia, and yet they do not get anywhere near the same amount of scrutiny. Another area of difference I would be thinking of is, let's say mining in Greenland does begin to pick up. Which countries are in a position right now to provide financial support for partnerships, to provide expertise, to provide labor, and the list gets considerably smaller. And this is something which is being looked at very carefully in Denmark right now, as you might imagine. It's like, okay, how can Europe potentially compete with other bidders? Because I stress again, you notice the map of Greenland, you notice all of those colored spaces which could indicate mines. One mine would require upwards of maybe 2,000 to 3,000 people and basically everything, including the kitchen sink, having to be brought in. That is a lot of money. And we have seen that mining operations in other parts of the world, including Canada, are not necessarily guaranteed to produce instant profits. So which countries are ready, willing, and able to go in and take that risk? You get a much smaller list. But China is certainly not the only Asian country that is interested in the potential raw material viability of the region.
Just briefly, I go along with most of what you say. I think the Korea, South Korea, and Japan are by far the most important of the other Asian countries, and particularly in shipping, and also gradually in oil and gas. And I mentioned South Korea and LNG, and they have the same, very much the same interest structure in terms of energy security and resource security, and therefore they see the resources in the Arctic as potentially extremely interesting. And you even have, and Singapore has exactly the role that you mentioned, even though it's far away. The last I think investment that I saw from an Asian country is Vietnam, that is now made an oil deal in the Arctic with either Rosneft or Gazprom, so a Vietnamese oil company. So it just shows the relevance of the Arctic to all of Asia, and there are Japanese investments already also in the Norwegian Arctic. So again, but it's a slow and gradual process. But I think if I was going to sort of, as you also saw from a ranking, I will hold South Korea a bit in front of Japan at the current moment, because I see South Korea may be willing to commit some more public resources towards the Arctic. Japan a bit more conservative in terms of seeing this as a potentially costly adventure. In the 90s, it was very different. Japan was much more active, but have been careful in terms of whether this can really make sense commercially. And that is the basic question, I think, for everybody, including China.
Okay, and then I have another comment that relates to what Mark said and also what Leif said, and that's the Russia-China relationship. You pointed, Mark, to some of the important signings in these ongoing negotiations, and this is primarily related to the energy resources in mainland Russia so far, right? But you, Leif, also pointed to the fact that Russia-China relations are important also, and Russia is of course a crucial importance to the development in the high north, also for China's role. And you assume that the geopolitical kind of tensions that we see will not kind of impact seriously.
I hope.
Yeah, and Mark, you didn't mention that. You didn't touch upon that topic so much, but could I just how strong are the institutions in the Arctic Council and the governance regime that is established and the spirit of cooperation? Is it somehow strong enough to buffer out these geopolitical tensions, or how do you see this developing?
Okay. Very good question. First of all, the Arctic Council itself, it is very much an informal body. One which, again, has been played up in the press that it's some kind of Arctic Parliament. No. It is very much operating by consensus. It is certainly based on the idea of mutual problem solving, with the idea that observers can provide input into the process, but their voting rights are obviously not present. Now, the question of whether current differences between Russia and the West will start to spill over into the Arctic Council, yes, very possible. But at the moment, and I stress at the moment, it is simply not possible for any one single state, Arctic or non-Arctic, to suddenly start going off in a unilateral direction in the Arctic, for the simple reason that the cost-benefit will not accept it. There was, for example, an absolutely hilarious article that came out of the Canadian press last year, and it talked about the fact that inevitably China's Navy vessels will start to patrol around the Arctic. I don't know if you read too many Tom Clancy novels or something like that. Even if that was the case, which it isn't, any one country to start taking a unilateral tack in the region would accomplish very little. All it would do was to basically unite other Arctic members against, this particular state's interest. The cost benefit does not work. It is in the benefits of all Arctic Council members to try to work out various forms of cooperation, various forms of consensus building, because it is simply too expensive on a variety of fronts to go off on some kind of unilateral tangent. Now, this may change. I hope it doesn't, but this may change if there are other issues that come up, if relations between Russia and the West continue to be complicated, or if there are significant, for example, oil and gas finds in the region that are in a disputed zone. This is all very hypothetical. But for now, the name of the game is still very much consensus building. Yes, there has been some spillover of tensions, for example, between Russia and Canada into the Council, but for the foreseeable future, I'm seeing this as primarily a diplomatic puzzle rather than something that might involve warships.
Yes, it's important, and I think the informality of the Arctic Council can be seen as a strength in this regard, because it makes it less vulnerable to complete deadlock in the current difficult political situation. But there have already been some meetings in Russia that the US and Canada has not attended, and at least it's been interpreted as sort of politically motivated. I don't know if it has, but so it's important, this perspective. It's a very informal body, the Arctic Council. So whatever happens there is not so important, neither to the resources nor to the great power rivalry in the region. But it is a problem, because I think also for Norway it's a challenge for Norwegian high north policies, because Norway has very often put forward the significant, important, comprehensive cooperation of Russia in the Arctic Council as one of its real strengths. And if it's not possible any longer to use the Arctic Council as a forum, even if it's very informal, it is still a major problem, even if the organization is not so important. But what do you have if you don't have the Arctic Council? So the informality, policy shaping role of the Arctic Council is very important, and this current situation illustrates that. And it is really a dilemma if this stops working. And I hope at least that it's possible, even in the presence of a continued conflict, that governments continue to see the value of discussing Arctic issues in a forum like the Arctic Council. But it's also the question about I think both Russia and also the other countries agree that the Arctic resources are so expensive and difficult to exploit that you need peace. There is no way, if there is a continued conflict, the Arctic is going to shut down. And already now we have a paradoxical situation with a lot of crises everywhere, and the oil price is going down. You don't see the oil price much further down until a lot of the resources in the Arctic are uneconomical. So it's this paradoxical situation where both the concern about climate change and falling oil prices are, and then also a geopolitical situation with a lot of conflicts between Russia and the other countries. It doesn't take long until both the oil and gas companies and the investors are leaving the Arctic. But Russia knows this, and Russia has the highest stakes in developing the economic resources of the Arctic. So in that sense, there's a piece of optimism that the Economist had a good 14-page article about the Arctic 2 years ago, and the main conclusion was there is too much to fight over. Everybody has such a strong interest in stability. So hopefully the Arctic can become a small glimmer of peace and hopes for peace, that also Russia sees the importance of cooperating with the other countries. And I think and China will definitely also have interest in the same direction.
At the same time, I think that some of partly the centenary for the First World War, and also some of the discussions going on, and shows that sometimes economic interdependence and economic benefits might, although there are lots of benefits of cooperation, often we're not good enough to realize that those gains, and we might end up with some kind of conflict. But now, if you look at the map here, Mark, I'm just throwing on a kind of final point, because if you have now talked about the high north, but you also came to us from New Zealand. It's hardly on the map here. It's gonna southeastern part, and it's almost as far away. So I just we now talked about the high north policy of China, but is there any similarities between the policies towards the Arctic and the Antarctic policy? Could you say something about New Zealand's reflections on kind of from down under somehow, and how they view the China in the Antarctic, and compare it to how we, Norway and this part, view China in the Arctic?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the Antarctic is also an area which China is looking at very carefully, although in the Antarctic you see a much stronger emphasis on the scientific aspect. A fourth Chinese scientific research station recently opened up in Antarctica, a fifth that's currently being surveyed right now. So this would definitely put China very much at the forefront in terms of the number of bases and installations in the Antarctic. This is certainly being looked at very carefully in New Zealand. There is a Antarctic Study Center in Christchurch, which has looked at Antarctic affairs very extensively. That said, though, most of the debate going on in the Antarctic tends to focus much more on scientific aspects as well as the questions over various Antarctic claims. Both New Zealand and Australia have particular claims in the Antarctic region. There are others. This is a very thorny international issue, which both the US and China have tried to very carefully step around. But China has, again, made it very clear in its policy in the Antarctic that our primary focus is, again, looking at scientific areas, looking at the question of how climate change might affect that part of the world. But the politics so far have been considerably more muted when you compare it to the Arctic, for the simple reason is that the number of players in the Antarctic are fewer, and their interests definitely tend to move further away from the hard strategy for now. This may change, although I don't see any catalyst to really change that in the near future.
Interesting, because maybe on this issue I may be going in the other direction from you, maybe emphasizing the political aspects a bit more. But I basically agree with your perspective. But I think it's important to be awake and also to have a long-term strategy. And I understand also that in the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that there's no more attention after a lot of just a lull and almost no attention over the last 10 or 15 years. There's a somewhat increasing interest because China is really focusing on the Antarctica, and between 70 and 80% of research funding to the polar areas goes to the Antarctica. Much more important than the Arctic. The Arctic is increasing a bit, but Antarctica is a major, as you say, a major scientific priority. And I think China is not doing this just as a scientific exercise. It's preparing for the long term, for the 2030, 2040, 2050, for the big discussions that might come in the future about global governance and also management of the resources, also in that part of the world. But it's very much a long-term perspective, and I think the Chinese and Asians are maybe better than us here in Norway about really thinking long-term. So I think it's an important issue to discuss, and I agree with you. I hope that the bilateral conflict between Norway and China subsides, and that we really also can discuss policies with China.
Okay, do you have any more hands up? No. And then I think it's time to thank Leiv for your comments and contribution to the discussions. Thank Mark for his presentation and good handling of questions, and thank all of you for showing up here. And there will be lots of other opportunities to discuss both the Arctic and to Asia and all kinds of other issues. So please keep posted. Thank you.